This is your English upgrade. Learning English beyond the classroom. A slow listening podcast for learners of English. My name is Maciej, and I'm an English teacher, a non-native speaker, and a learner myself. In this podcast, you're listening to my real voice, not an AI one. And I speak a little more slowly and clearly to help you follow and reflect. You can download the transcript, vocabulary notes, and exercises for this episode from my learning community, Your English Upgrade. You can find the link to these resources in the description below. Hello and welcome to the podcast. In this episode, I'd like to talk about myself as a learner of English. Not as a teacher, not as someone who explains grammar rules or pronunciation patterns, but simply a learner. When you study with me, it's often easy for you to forget that I am a non-native speaker and I used to learn English just the way you did. Because before I was ever an English teacher, before English became my profession, and before it became part of my identity, I was just someone trying to understand this language, sometimes successfully, sometimes not at all. And I think this is important. Many learners believe that people who speak English very well, or people who teach English, must have had a smooth, logical, well-planned learning journey. And to a certain extent, and for some people, this might be true. It might be true that they had a learning journey with clear steps, clear progress, and no real confusion. But that was absolutely not my experience. My journey with English was fairly messy. It had long pauses, and it had moments of overconfidence, something I used to be very, very guilty of. And moments where I didn't even realize how much I still didn't know. So in this episode, I want to take you through that journey, slowly and honestly, and without trying to make it sound better or more impressive than it really was. So, let's start at the beginning. While it may sound strange to you, until I was about 10 or 11 years old, English simply did not exist in my life. I grew up in Poland, and when I was very young, Poland was still a communist country, and access to English teaching, and English learning materials was extremely limited. English wasn't taught at school, it wasn't something you heard on TV, and it wasn't something that people talked about. So English wasn't difficult for me, it wasn't frustrating, it just wasn't there. And that's an important point. Many people believe that in order to be able to speak English at a near native level, you need to start learning it as a child, at a very, very young age. And I'm actually proof that this is not the case. You can still start learning English at a later age in life and still get to a very, very high, near native-like level. So for me, English entered my life quite suddenly, and actually through one person in particular, my father. My dad was learning English on his own. He was extremely motivated, and so he was buying this very basic English course from a local kiosk. That course consisted of vocabulary notebooks, exercises, and cassette tapes. And for the younger audience, cassettes used to be those strange devices that you'd put into a big box that was called a cassette player, And you could basically listen to music or English or whatever it was. But it was a pretty primitive thing when it came to technology. So he used to buy this English course that consisted basically of a very simple vocabulary notebook full of exercises and vocabulary lists, and that was accompanied by tapes, cassette tapes. And one day he suggested that we should learn English together. And I think his motivation was very practical at that point. He was a medical doctor, he traveled, he had done a professional exchange in Italy at one point in his life. And I think, he found English very, very useful, simply. So to my dad, English meant access, communication, and opportunity. And for me, the motivation was different. I admired my father. I always looked up to him. And the idea of learning something together at the same time felt really exciting. And this was something that was very motivating for me because there were no exams, there were no grades, there was no school pressure, there was a different kind of pressure. My dad is a perfectionist, and he used to require the same kind of perfection when it came to study from me. And I really liked it. I'm a perfectionist myself. Probably I take after my dad in this respect. So, just to finish that little section of the podcast, English entered my life quietly as something adult, useful, and meaningful. And that probably matters more than people often realize. At the beginning, when we tried learning English, we were using comic strip materials. It was, I think, a BBC comic designed for children learning English. So it was colorful, it was playful, and it was meant to be fun. And it did absolutely nothing for me or my dad when it came to learning English. So obviously, he was studying from materials that were meant to be for adults. And he looked for something that would be easier for myself to use and that would be more childlike. And I'm a very logically thinking person, and I never took to comic strips. For some reason, they just don't evoke emotions in me, and it's very hard for me to imagine what is actually happening. The little text that's there and lots of drawing, it's just something that I can't work with. So we very quickly discovered with my dad that those materials, those comic strips, didn't really do their job at all. They didn't work. We just couldn't connect with the material. So my dad, I guess quite hesitantly, suggested something else, and it was his own English course. And that course, as I said, was designed for adults. There were no pictures there, no stories, extremely little context. It was basically a course which was based on long vocabulary lists, translation from Polish into English and from English to Polish. It was actually done by non-native Polish speakers, experts in English, and then there were exercises, and this was all accompanied by those tapes that I had mentioned to you, the audio recordings. So the topics were very adult. It was about government, history, institution, public figures. So by modern standards, modern teaching standards, in terms of methodology, it was really poor. And yet, it worked fantastically for me. So for me, learning looked like this. I listened to the tape, I repeated the words, I checked the translation. Very often, I was learning words that were really adult words because they were associated with those topics that I had mentioned, like government, history, institutions, public figures. So it was difficult vocabulary. And on the one hand, this was quite advanced vocabulary. And on the other hand, a big disadvantage to this whole course was that it didn't teach me conversational English or functional English in any way. My dad would sit down with me every time I announced that I had finished studying a given unit, and then we would do a test, because there was a test at the end of each unit. And perfection was required in this context, and I also wanted to please my dad, because his opinion of my English and of myself obviously mattered enormously to me. And they were quite difficult tests because it was a test which was based on translation. If I remember correctly, it was translation from Polish to English and then also from English to Polish. And it was quite difficult. It was quite difficult because sometimes I didn't even understand the sentences very well. And so doing those tests with my dad was a slightly stressful experience for me. But at one point, I discovered there was an answer key in the book. And sorry, Dad, but I never told you about it. Before every test, I looked at those answers and I prepared perfectly. So, right about from more or less the middle of the course, I started doing those tests perfectly. And I basically lied to my dad that I had never checked the answer key, because obviously he was using the answer key to check whether I was doing a good job in terms of those answers. And yeah, I got everything right. So yeah, I was totally cheating. But what really happened was that I still had to understand the language that I was producing. I still had to learn the pronunciation and learn the grammar structures that were required in those translations. And because I was doing the test with my dad, I got positive reinforcement. And that confidence, especially that early confidence, was a very powerful learning tool. So when English finally appeared at school, and this was probably when I was about 13, something strange happened. I very quickly discovered that my English was much better than that of my classmates, and sadly, it was often better than that of my teachers. That gave me enormous confidence, and unfortunately, since I was in my teenage years, it also resulted in quite a lot of arrogance. So I openly corrected my teacher, especially when it came to pronunciation, and that always meant that she was going on the defensive. I got bad marks, or she would write a note to my parents. And to be honest, I just didn't care. I knew that I was right. That early success really empowered me. With the benefit of the hindsight, I can very clearly see that that early success and that confidence really distorted my idea of how good I was at English. Because I was in an environment where there was really very little challenge in terms of what I could do, because I was better than everybody around me, I didn't realize how much I didn't know. At the same time, I discovered something quite important about myself and the way I learned, and that was that I'm an audio learner. It means that I loved listening, I loved repeating what I heard, I learned long texts, sometimes over 300 words long, by heart, and I listened to them again and again, and I said them again and again. And it was this kind of practice that I guess later on resulted in greater fluency and this love for pronunciation that I have. And when it came to those texts, I would learn them from my father's course. I would stand in front of the class and recite them from memory. And my teacher always said, Maciej, more slowly, more slowly. I have to admit very guiltily that I loved that moment because I felt confident, I felt visible, I felt good at something. And ironically, this didn't mean that my speaking ability was good. It was actually almost non-existent because I was reciting things from memory. There was no dialogue, no interaction, no spontaneous conversation in my learning. So it was basically learning the vocabulary, doing the test with my dad, learning that longer text, and reeling it off in front of my mates, and of course, feeling great about the whole experience. But underneath all that, as a learner and as an English speaker, I was crap because I had no idea of how to interact and how to hold a spontaneous conversation in English. And I think this was also something that my dad was quite keenly aware of. I think he knew that in order to make my learning journey more complete, I had to start interacting in English. And he had this wonderful idea of organizing a stay for me, a 2-week language stay in Oxford. And this felt like something very big for me. It was my first experience of being abroad on my own. I was living in a family over there in Oxford. It was a new country, a completely new language environment, and there were no Polish people around me. So the idea, of course, was immersion. And the way it worked in practice was that I went to English classes in the morning, there were activities in the afternoon and in the evening, and I lived with a host family. And English was everywhere. And emotionally, I remember this experience as extremely positive because I felt independent, I felt like a grown up. I was really proud of myself for being there, and it was exciting, it was motivating, it made English feel real. I also fell in love for the first time during that stay in Oxford, so it was a very memorable experience for me. But actually, when I look back at this experience now, and I have to be very honest, from a learning point of view, from a language learning point of view, this stay did not dramatically change my English. And I think this is important for any of you listening to realize that this is a very common belief that people have, that going abroad for a very short time, like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, will suddenly transform their English. And that simply isn't true, because 2 weeks or even 3 weeks is just not enough. Even a month is not enough. So real language change takes time. It takes repetition. It takes real exposure and interaction over a longer period of time. The more intense, the better. So if you are listening to this and you were ever considering doing a language course over there in England or in the States or in Australia, or you thought of maybe organizing a language stay for one of your kids, do take it into account and be realistic that the stay is probably going to have a very positive experience at the level of personal development for yourself or for your child, but it will not dramatically change your child's English or your English. Perhaps it will result in greater motivation for learning English, which is a huge win, but it will not transform your English. These expectations are simply unrealistic. And I think that's important to take into account, because if you've ever been in the situation when you came back from a stay abroad and you were feeling disappointed that nothing actually happened with your English, that's fine. It's natural. There's nothing wrong with you. In any case, coming back to my story as a learner of English, when I came back from Oxford, I was on cloud nine. Obviously, I was feeling great about the whole experience. But This was also a time when I started secondary school. And again, I found myself in this environment where I was simply at the top and there was no challenge for me. And I didn't have the presence of mind to actually say to myself that there's still a lot that I need to learn. And I didn't challenge myself in the slightest. So I was basically just cruising through high school. I sailed through all those exams. There was no pressure. And yeah, sadly, when it came to learning English, I just stopped growing. It's true that I studied a bit of grammar on my own, and it was mainly from the Bible in terms of grammar learning and teaching, which is English Grammar in Use by Raymond Murphy, the Blue Book. I'm sure as a language learner you're familiar with it, and if you're not familiar with it, do check it out because it's a wonderful book when it comes to self-study of grammar. And I guess because of that, also, grammar became my comfort zone. It was safe, it was measurable, it was controlled, and I had absolutely no reason at that point not to be proud of my English. And for a long time, that was the situation. But this pride, unfortunately, as I said, became a plateau. And fortunately, two important things happened. First, my teacher changed, and I was suddenly being taught by someone who was enthusiastic and who genuinely loved English. And his English wasn't perfect, but his attitude was. He would share curiosities with us, he would challenge me in class. So all of this resulted in a boost of motivation for me. And suddenly I wanted to learn again. And the second thing that happened was that I had a friend who'd been learning English on his own, and he wanted to do a Cambridge Advanced Preparation course. And I thought it was a great idea. And for the first time, when I started doing that course, I was surrounded by people who spoke English that was as good as mine or better. And they interacted naturally, they sounded fluent, and they made my English feel almost theoretical. And it was the first moment in my life when I started feeling slightly uncomfortable about my English, but it was very, very necessary. All of this resulted in a huge motivation boost. And when I was 18, I knew that I wanted to become an English teacher. And going to university and studying the methodology of teaching English and English philology really transformed my relationship with English. So I learned thousands of words every year. I had the TV on in English constantly. It was basically part of the background. I had this hypothesis that if I was exposed to English constantly and the TV was playing at a very low volume, my brain would somehow acquire more vocabulary or the music of English. And I think I wasn't wrong in that, because 3 years of this constant exposure, I think, must have rubbed off. Perhaps a slightly surprising fact for you about that time I was at university can be that I actually studied American pronunciation. I spoke very good Northern New York accent. I was told by my teachers many times that I should actually be a news anchor. And again, this was something that I was very, very proud of. English basically at that point stopped being a subject. It became part of who I was. It became part of my identity. One of the things that I used to really enjoy was helping my classmates with their homework. So I would, for example, write 3 or 4 essays per week, including my own, And I would write them in such a way that the teacher wouldn't recognize that they were written by the same person. And this was a time when artificial intelligence did not exist, so I couldn't ask ChatGPT to write it in a different style for me. I had to do it myself. And it was an extremely useful exercise when it came to learning English, because it enabled me to develop a lot of language flexibility and depth. And this is when I would say that English became truly mine. I owned English at that point. At least I thought I did. There was still so much to learn. And at that time, I was already teaching English. I was working at a small language school, teaching English by something called the Callan method. If you've never heard of the Callan method, please don't worry, you haven't really missed anything. It's a horrible method for teaching English. But it was my first job as a teacher, and I really enjoyed it, and it gave me valuable experience. And then basically, after finishing university, I went to live in England. And it's actually a funny story, because my original intention had been to open a language school in Poland. And practically everything was set up for me to start that project. And in hindsight, thank God I didn't. So as luck would have it, just before starting that very project, I met a beautiful young woman who came to me to do some private English lessons, and she was going to London to study journalism there. And long story short, we fell for each other, and I decided to abandon my plans of opening the language school and follow her to London. And this was probably, as I said, the best decision I had ever made in my life, because it opened a door to a completely new life. A life which required a lot of independence, proactivity, willingness to try new things. And funnily enough, my idea when I was going to London was that with my university qualifications and my great English, I'd find work as a teacher. But I quickly discovered that my qualifications stood for nothing in England. They basically meant absolutely nothing to any prospective employer. And in order to teach English, I had to redo my language teaching qualifications. At the same time, I realized that communicating with native speakers was actually really difficult for me. My English felt artificial. I had the impression that I sounded really unnatural when I spoke with people. And I actually wasn't wrong. I come from a culture where people would think highly of your language ability if you used a lot of advanced vocabulary and put this vocabulary into complex long structures. And that was the way that I tried to speak English. I was using difficult words, advanced idiomatic expressions, and really complex grammar. And all it really resulted in was that I sounded completely out of place in everyday conversation. I remember my tutor at that teacher training course telling me that no one was interested in listening to this flowery English of mine. And it was like a bucket of cold water, a real wake-up call for me. It made me realize, basically, that I still had a long way to go as an English learner. And you may remember also that I told you that I spoke with an American accent at that time. And this was another challenge for me, because living in the UK, I wanted to sound like a British native speaker. And at the beginning, I definitely didn't sound like one. But slowly, as I was paying attention to how people spoke English around me, my accent began to shift towards British English. What really helped me in this context was that I'm an audio learner. I really absorb sounds and I imitate them. And today, when you listen to my English, it's quite close to pure British English, but it's not 100% British. I'd actually describe my current accent as international English that leans significantly towards British English, but is definitely not 100% pure British English. And I'm totally comfortable with that. I know that I sometimes slip in an occasional sound where it shouldn't be there, or I'll stress a word in an American way rather than the British way. But that's okay. I actually love catching myself out in this context. And in here, I wanted to share that I still sometimes make mistakes. It's true. Learners are often surprised to hear that, but I do make mistakes. And whenever I discover one, I really do my best to root it out. But it's not often easy because many of those errors are quite fossilized. For instance, just to give you an example of a mistake that I'd been making, it was the word pronoun. I used to pronounce it with the short O sound in that first syllable, and that's completely incorrect. And you can definitely hear me making this mistake in my earlier videos. Another of these errors was the word auxiliary. Again, this was a very basic word when you're a teacher because you use it all the time. But mistakes like these happen. So basically, don't be thinking that my English is perfect. Actually, it's far from it. I'm still a learner and I still make mistakes. And even now, I don't understand everything. There are situations where I simply struggle, like, for example, speaking to native speakers in noisy places, or several people speaking at the same time in very fast informal speech. It's a nightmare for me at the level of understanding, but it's normal. Sure, it feels really, really frustrating, but it's completely normal. So that's what I want to leave you with. I am still a learner of English. I am still discovering mistakes I acquired years ago, their fossilized habits, those blind spots, but they happen. So I'm still enjoying the learning process. If you would like to download any resources for this podcast, or you would like to practice your speaking or pronunciation, please consider joining Your English Upgrade. It's my learning platform. It's mainly directed at helping you learn pronunciation and gain more confidence when it comes to speaking English. Joining the platform is free. You have access to many great resources and video lessons. And in case you feel you need more support on your learning journey, you can upgrade your subscription and, well, do some wonderful things, really. So the link is in the description. Consider joining. And until the next episode, thank you very much for listening.